Welcome to our afternoon session, panel discussion on human rights and for the rights for a better life. The intent and goal of the event was all well explained in the concept note speech, and I learned a lot from the previous sessions, not only from the documentary, but from the talk show. Well, in this session, what we are going to do is we're trying to find some form of solution, the way forward, how the UN perspective can shed spotlight on this blind spot of human security, and what can be done about the problem. We have two very special panelists here with us today. We have Ambassador Joon, former South Korean ambassador to the United Nations, and currently the chairman of Save the Children Korea. We have Mr. Imesh Pokharel, the representative of the UN Office of the High Commissioners for Human Rights in Seoul. Let's welcome them with a big round of applause. To give a very brief introduction of the biography of the two speakers today, Ambassador Oh has been a career diplomat, and he is a specialist in multilateral diplomacy. He served as the UN South Korean ambassador to the UN. And now he is the chairman of the Save the Children of Korea, advocating the rights for children around the world. He is also serving as professor at Kyung University's Graduate Institute of Peace Studies. And he is now now here with us to give us some insight about the North Korean human rights as an international perspective. Mr. Imesh Pokharel is a representative at Interim of the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Seoul. He has worked with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights since 2006 as a regional emergency coordinator for Asia. He had experience in serving for the program and as a human rights officer in Thailand, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Malaysia, Geneva, and Nepal. He has expertise in rule of law, democratic governance, accountability, humanitarian action, and peace building. So I think we are ready to bring our problem to an international framework. We will hear from each speaker about their perspective on the issue, hopefully 10 minutes maximum. Then we'll have a couple roundings or follow-up discussions. Then we'll open to the floor for questions. And those who are joining us via Zoom, you may leave your questions in the chat box. So shall we start with Ambassador Oh? Ambassador Oh, you're pretty well known to the youth of Korea and around the world. Especially, you're famous for your touching speech at the UN Security Council in 2015. It inspired the youth in the world. And I think the audience should be reminded of this speech today, especially we have the third country-born defectors' children here, and maybe they could watch this to be inspired as well. So I would like to see a short video clip before we start with Ambassador Oh's speech today.
We cannot read what is described in the COI report without it breaking our hearts. We cannot listen to stories of North Korean defectors without sharing in their tears, without feeling as if we are there with them experiencing the tragedies. We only hope that one day in the future, when we look back on what we did today, we will be able to say that we did the right thing for the people of North Korea, for the lives of every man and woman, boy and girl, who has the same human rights as the rest of us. Thank you.
Well, it's still touching, even of today. I hope we are doing the right thing today as well. So, Ambassador Oh, could you share your thoughts on why North Korean human rights is an international issue?
Thank you very much, Professor Kwon. It's great to be here. And the shortest way of embarrassing me before I speak is to show this video clip. Thank you for that. And I'm very glad to meet students and faculty here at George Mason University. This is my first time here. And it's great to be with Mr. Pokharel, who is running Human Rights Office here in Seoul. I know that the focus of the meeting today is on North Korean defectors, particularly who are in China, for example. But what I would like to give you is a kind of a big picture, kind of background to all of these concrete issues, because I want to discuss how the North Korean human rights issue has become an international issue, especially in the UN. I'm going to speak a little slowly because as I'm wearing a mask, if I speak too fast, I will be out of breath. So bear with me. Well, as you know, the modern concept of human rights is very well expressed in Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, which says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Human rights is by now a global idea, as most governments, whether they are democratic or not, are showing some level of commitment to human rights. Human rights also constitute one of the three pillars of the United Nations, along with peace and development. Violations of human rights can take place anywhere in all corners of society, like domestic violence at home, bullying in school, sexual harassment at work. But most serious violations are committed by states. States are supposed to protect human rights of citizens, but states are the most powerful institution humans ever created. It is the states that are the most serious human rights violator. You can just think about Holocaust during World War II, killing fields in Cambodia in the 1970s. In today's world, the UN's efforts, international community's efforts to promote human rights are naturally focusing on protecting people from state violations. Basically, there are three things what the United Nations is doing. One, human rights dialogue. They talk to the governments to promote human rights. Two, naming and shaming, mostly in the form of human rights resolutions adopted by General Assembly or Human Rights Council. Three, there are new and more coercive approaches, which are quite new, involving the responsibility to protect R2P and International Criminal Court, ICC. The human rights situation in North Korea came into light in 1990s when the North Korean defectors, Skps, came out of North Korea and made their testimonies. So the United Nations, based on these stories of North Korean defectors, United Nations started to deal with the North Korean human rights issue from 2003. Let's see how the United Nations have been applying these three approaches, three measures to North Korean case. Human rights dialogue. Well, there has been only one case of bilateral human rights dialogue with North Korea worth mentioning, which was the European Union's human rights dialogue with Dprk in 2001. It was very short-lived because it stopped only in 2 years when European Union decided to bring the issue to the United Nations in 2003. So North Korea got very upset about it, so they stopped dialogue with the European Union. Naming and shaming. Since 2003, there have been always North Korea human rights resolutions, both at Human Rights Council in Geneva and General Assembly in New York. Well, opinion is divided as to how effective naming and shaming is. But actually, if you think about it, the United Nations has enforcement power only on issues of peace and security. So they don't have enforcement power on human rights issues. So naming and shaming, in my opinion, is effective to a certain extent because no country wants to be shamed. No country wants to be called, no government wants to be called human rights violator. So to a certain extent, it's effective. But North Korea, until 2014, more or less disregarded international pressure. But in 2014, when the Commission of Inquiry created by Human Rights Council came out with their report, it changed the game because the report concluded that human rights violations by North Korea constituted crime against humanity. Crime against humanity is not a rhetoric. Crime against humanity qualifies for R2P, responsibility to protect, and ICC, International Criminal Court. So North Koreans got sensitive about it, and they showed stronger reaction, which is good for naming and shaming, because when you do naming and shaming, you expect countries to be sensitive about it, not just to shrug it off. R2P and ICC, even though they are technically applicable to North Korean case, I don't think it's realistic to expect, the North Korean case will be applied to these two concepts in the near future, not least because you have to get approval of Security Council, where China and Russia are permanent members with veto power. So they will probably protect North Korea in that context. So what can South Korea do for human rights in North Korea then? In my opinion, the situation of human rights in North Korea is, of course, a great concern for South Korea, not only because the suffering of North Korean people is felt more personally by South Koreans, like I said in the speech you just saw, but also because without protection of human rights in the North, peace and security on the peninsula will always remain fragile. The Moon Jae-in government, the sitting government in Korea, is keen on making peace more durable and seems to believe that raising the human rights issue with North Korea might risk spoiling rapprochement with Pyongyang. Hence, the reluctance in pushing forward with the human rights agenda. Taking this situation into consideration, I would like to suggest three approaches the ROK government might consider with regard to human rights in North Korea. Three approaches: non-political approach, institutional approach, and non-government approach. Non-political approach, what I mean is, we should make efforts to render the issue as non-political and technical as possible. To put it bluntly, using human rights to bash the Kim Jong-un regime is as political as turning a blind eye to them for fear of upsetting the Kim Jong-un regime. So either way, I think it's political. So in other words, we can do what we can to improve human rights in North Korea purely based on human rights considerations. In doing so, the South Korean government should continue to play its role in international naming and shaming. South Korea has stopped co-sponsoring the UN General Assembly resolution on human rights 2 years ago, which I think was wrong because South Korea cited the reason for that as they are taking into account comprehensive consideration of the current situation on the Korean Peninsula, but this is a political consideration. So such a political approach is not desirable as it will only weaken South Korea's principled position on the issue internationally and also vis-a-vis North Korea. You know, if another country comes to South Korean government and please stop sponsoring resolution, then what can we say? We should be able to say that, no, we don't apply political consideration to human rights issue. But if we are doing this to North Korea, then you are losing your answer. So it's not a wise policy change. Second, institutional approach, what I mean is we already have the North Korean Human Rights Act passed in 26, 5 years ago. So the South Korean government can fully utilize this act. And, you know, if there is any pushback from Pyongyang, Seoul can always fall back on its obligation to go by the law, and it would give more legitimacy to the South Korean government's action and also help consolidate South Korea's long-standing advocacy of human rights and democracy, both international and domestic contexts. 3, non-governmental approach. When government-level exchanges are, geared more at rapprochement, there are a number of civil society organizations in South Korea devoted to raising awareness on and promoting human rights in North Korea. Like Think Today, I forgot to thank Ms. Son Moon-kyung, head of Think, who is co-organizing this event as well. Having said that, finally, I think considering what is happening on the Korean Peninsula, recently one might think this is a time to pay more attention to security rather than human rights in North Korea. But if you think about it, when it comes to North Korea, issues of security, economic development, and human rights are all intertwined. The Kim regime is overly focused on attaining security through nuclear weapons, which has brought the international sanctions, which makes economic development impossible, rendering people more and more unhappy, which leads to more crackdown on people for regime survival, a perfect vicious cycle. North Korea is now at a critical juncture for its future. Nuclear bombs do not give Kim Jong-un regime security it desires. What he and his regime need now in order to remain in power are not weapons, but food, clothes, cars, and smartphones for people on the streets and their freedom to enjoy them. It would be in the interest of the regime itself to seek change rather than waiting to be changed. By doing so, Pyongyang can make the right choice and embark on a truly new beginning to change life in North Korea so that its people can live with human dignity and rights. Then the international issue called human rights in North Korea will no longer exist. Thank you.
Earlier in the second session, Professor Soyoung Kim said maybe international community can pressure on the Chinese government to stop the repatriation. Maybe that could be one solution to resolve the gray zone. I think Ambassador always talking about more fundamental root cause of the gray zone of human security. How we can improve the human security of those in North Korea who would not have to leave the country if that human rights is secure in their own home country. They don't have to go through all that trouble in the gray zone. So I think your insightful thought is very important because this is supposed to be the very first step to be resolved for us to stop this human rights violation taking place for those North Koreans who defected the country. Now, I would like to move on to Mr. Pokharel. I can see that you worked on human rights issues in various Asian countries, and now you're here in Korea. I would like to hear from you what the UN is doing to advocate universal human rights and how these vulnerable people that you saw in second session, you heard a lot about them, how could they be seen within the vision of the United Nations and Sustainable Development Goals? So you could give us a little bit of overview of the UN's viewpoints, but also your suggestions and recommendations.
All right, thank you. Hello. Yeah. All right, thank you very much. I would first like to thank the Center for Security Studies, George Mason University, for organizing this program. Also to Ambassador O and Professor Kwon for facilitating here and sharing your views. I was impressed by the stories said earlier in the sessions today, and a lot of things did came up. Before I go into the main issues, I would like to give you a very brief introduction of the office, our office in Seoul, which was established in 2015 following the Commission of Inquiry report in 2014 to follow up on the recommendations made by the Commission of Inquiry. So our main work is to monitor and document human rights violations, provide visibility to the human rights situation in the Dprk, and also to engage with different stakeholders like today to raise the profile of the human rights issues in the Dprk. We also engage with the government, although it's limited with the Dprk government. We do talk with them on a regular basis, just to let you know. And during the course of our work, we meet with a lot of Dprk Skps community for interviewing, to know their stories, and they have been the major source of information or contacts for us to do our work effectively. So we would like to thank all of the Skps community living in the ROK who have shared their stories with us. Before I touch on the solutions thing, I would like to highlight on what are the contributions of the Dprk Skps to the international community and why it is important to support them. As we all know, Dprk is a country which is pretty much closed. International community engagement in the Dprk is limited. People-to-people engagement is even more limited. We have few UN and humanitarian organizations inside the country, but again, engagement at the local level is very, very limited. So the only way the international community is able to learn about the Dprk political security, human rights, or even cultural aspects is through the stories of each and every escapees. We would not have a similar understanding of the broader political, the security or human rights issues without the contribution or the openness from the escapees community. So there is a myth that the escapees community only says human rights, but that's not true. I think there is equally important information on political and security structures and even societal, about the society that we receive from the escapee story, and which does help the many member states to formulate their policies on the Dprk. So their role is very, very important. Why it's important? If you look into from a reunification perspective, I think it's the success of reunification in the future, if that happens, will be determined by how well the escapees community can adjust in the ROK now. You know, and I think there is politically, I think there is an advantage for all governments, primarily the ROK government, to make this a success, to demonstrate that the unification is possible, you know, because the perception of the people of the Dprk towards the ROK or the international community will not be shaped just by how much humanitarian assistance we provide or what political solutions happens. It will also be shaped by how well the ROK or the international community treats the escapees community. And if we treat them well, or at least make them sure that that's being protected, then the Dprk people living back home would feel more confident about the international community. So I think it's in the interest of the international community, ROK, and the other governments to provide protections to the escapees and the people who have made their way out of the country. Protection of Dprk escapees, I wouldn't touch much on the problems or issues, because we know that there are many people are satisfied with the free environment, and many have said to us that they are happy with, because they're paid for the work that they do, which is not normally happens in the Dprk. But we also have to acknowledge that many escapees come here alone and do not have a family support system. Communication back home is very, very hard compared to, if you see, even in all parts of the world, communication has been extremely easy, except North Korea and most possibly Eritrea, you know, but that's one place where the separation is hard, because the communication back home is not easy. The cultural differences puts a pressure on the Dprk. Well, it's the same society, I would say, but the functioning is slightly different, at least from my understanding. We have seen with Vietnam refugees or even in other contexts that there's people who feel a sense of guilt of living behind their families, and that's definitely puts a bit of hardship on the community. Economic difficulties are always there. There are a lot of studies on that where there might not be enough jobs or skills issues comes into considerations, and even the example of the death of a mother and a child in the previous year can be a good example, or a stark reminder for all of us that there are vulnerable areas which needs to be looked into more carefully. Students, when we have engaged with students, we have found them to be hard in adjusting to school. Again, due to differences in the school system, it's also because of the the way they are raised in the two different cultures. There are also issues of the debts to brokers when they come, which also puts additional pressure. So there are issues. I just wanted to highlight a few of the issues there. What can we do then? I think the first thing could be an inclusiveness and supporting the adaptation to the new context. In the recent years, we have seen SKPs contesting for public offices and some being elected for leadership positions. I think this is a positive development. This is a strong message to the SKPs community that if they try, I think there is a possibility to reach to the leadership positions. I think this should be built upon to ensure that fair chances of representations of the SKPs at the policy level. I think that can be one of the way. ROK is not very ethnically diverse, and as the society like ROK, in every society, they expects the newcomers to change the behavior and be assimilated. I think, and our office has been raising this also, the government and other stakeholders, I think there needs to be some dialogue at the community level to discuss the benefits of cultural diversity and its usefulness in the society and economy, because with the aging population and many migrants workers also coming in, I think it might be a right time to also address the Dprk SKP's issues from this lens, because I think it's easy to, because we think that it's easy to assimilate, but I think if there is a narrative that is built upon that it's okay to be the different and to see the benefits, then I think that narrative should be strengthened. Again, the SKP's contributions to the ROK society needs to be, at least the positive social narratives has to be promoted, and at the national or even local level. Last year we did a report on the inclusiveness in the peace processes, and we wrote a letter to the US and the ROK government on the need for at least engaging with the Dprk SKP's community to know their views, but also to tell what is happening in the peace process and what they are exactly trying to come up with, because that has not happened. So there is a need for, even during the peace process, there is a need for at least reaching out to the SKP's community to know what is happening, or to tell them what they are doing and how the peace process would evolve on a long run. And again, the welfare approach to the protections has to be somehow moved away from. I think the SKP's community do have a right and to educations, not to be left behind under the SDGs. And so I think looking from a rights perspective rather than a welfare lens might be a good way to approach the issue. There are issues like social and personal. I think HANA Foundation has found that 12% has suicidal impulse, mental issues because of hardship. I think this is not a great picture, given that that there are such a big number of people who are in a psychosocial support, need of psychosocial support. I think there has to be mechanisms for self-help groups, especially for women. There was few NGOs who have told me that it's establishing a family here might be harder because many women are married in China and have kids, so it's difficult to find partners. And also there are at times economic and power differences within the family structure. Even if they are married, women are vulnerable to abuse. So there needs to be safe spaces to report and get support whenever whenever needed. On the economic side, I think there has to be, which I've seen in some of the news also, and there might be already a policy on that, that financial incentives can be given to companies who hire SKPs. The skill sets that were acquired in the Dprk, there has to be a system where those skill sets needs to be at least acknowledged or considered. Like I met a medical professional who has practiced a lot in Dprk, but now he might not be able to practice here, and how do we address that? That problem has to be found, because he might not be able to do other work, and he cannot do his own work. So how do we address that? Single parents, I think, has to be taken care of a bit more and has to be looked differently. Many SKPs sends money back to the families, almost most of them, but there is a considerable amount that goes into brokerage fees. I think there needs to be some efficient way to help that transfer, and whether it's through China or somewhere, and I think the governments or the international community, at least in that sense, might have to find a more efficient way to help the people send the money back home. For the education youths, I think individual strengths of the each children has to be acknowledged, and there has to be a safe environment for SKP's children. So those can be some of the things that can happen in the ROK itself. There are protection issues in China, because many Dprk SKPs travel to China for economic opportunities, but due to the restrictions on the freedom movement, there is also risks of trafficking. We have also seen forced marriages and exploitation in the forced labor and prostitutions. And the brokerage fee is pretty high, and we have heard that has gone pretty high these years, in the recent years, which is also adds to a burden, but also can be adds to the vulnerability also. We published a report last year on the risks of repatriation to the Dprk from China. So we understand the vulnerability of the people who are repatriated back to China. What can be done, and what we have been doing also, there is a continued advocacy with the Dprk to decriminalize freedom movement, at least, and to support the safe and orderly migrations. Again, that might be not easy, but we will have to continue to advocate. As Professor said, the root causes of migrations also needs to be addressed, which is improving the economic and political situations out there. We have been engaging with China to encouraging them not to repatriate the Dprk SKPs. We have witnessed some changes there in the recent years. Some of the Dprk SKPs, primarily those who have Chinese husbands, have been released from detentions in some cases. We have also tried to look into few cases where there is a humanitarian exemptions. We have been lobbying with China primarily to allow them to work legally on some sectors, because whether they allow, even and illegally, there are many Dprk SKPs who are working, so making them legal would reduce the vulnerability and at least protect the SKPs from exploitation. So that has been continuously pushing. The women who have been trafficked, we have asked them to treat them as survivors and not to be repatriated, and to provide with adequate support. I think the statelessness of the children born to the Chinese parents, that needs to be addressed, and that might be a difficult one, but that needs to be addressed. I think that we have also been engaging with the ROK government here to be a bit proactive when there are cases involving SKPs who are living here and have the families who are arrested in China. At least that's the basic minimum we have been asking from the government here. And in some cases, we have seen that being happening. As for the UN role, we're doing a bit on that, and that's what we can do together as a UN community. As for the UN role, we have been providing visibility to the international community on the Dprk human rights issues. And if you see, we produce different reports on an annual basis. We report to the Human Rights Council, to the General Assembly, to the Security Council, and try to update the international community on what is happening in terms of rights violations in the Dprk. We are also providing visibility to the Skps and telling them their stories if they agree to. There are also humanitarian agencies and UN working inside the Dprk who are supporting with health, sanitations, and food. Although limited, I think that's also the support that the UN is providing. We, as I said previously, we also talk with the Dprk government to discuss human rights. Again, it's limited, but we're trying our best on that. Yeah, well, the other part, I think what we are doing is also looking into accountability for serious human rights violations. Again, as Ambassador O said, that's unlikely now, but at least we're documenting and keeping the record straight. So I would leave it there and for questions, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pokharel. I was going to ask him, what can we expect from the UN? And it looks like the UN is doing a lot. And it's just that you have been addressing the issues, you're aware of the issue, and you've been even requesting the Chinese government and other relevant states to bring actions to the issues. However, at the grassroots level, we really don't feel that there's much impact. And I guess there's a bit of a gap between what the UN is doing and what we are expecting from the UN. I mean, we always want fast result, visible change. Anyways, since we have got some answers from you, what UN was doing, I could perhaps have a quick follow-up question. I definitely would like to get questions from the audience as well. So let's just have a hopeful note, hopeful remark. Within the SDGs, I mean, we have this young students here who are the children who have experienced that difficulty. Like, how could we help youth empowerment of the children of the defectors? Especially the UN has a vision for the young people within the Sustainable Development Goals. So perhaps that's something that you could tell them, to see what they can expect for their youth empowerment. And I also have a question for Ambassador O. As the chairman of the Save the Children, we mentioned about the children who are born in China and having difficulty gaining citizenship and the rightful protection. So perhaps you have some thoughts on the basic rights that a child rightfully deserves in regards to the children of the North Korean defectors who are not granted nationality and protection from China. And that's something that I would like to hear from you. Maybe very quick comments on my question. Maybe Mr. Pokharel, GGs.
From the SDGs perspectives, I think for the students or the youths who are living here at least, I think the SDGs, if you know, primarily is about leaving no one behind, which is basically means there can be differences. People can be different. The society have different groups of individuals. But when we are looking for a development model, then the SDGs framework says that while you support the majority, but you also have to keep a special eye on the minorities or who might be left behind. And I think that's an excellent framework when we are talking about people from the Skps community. What are some of the concerns for the Dprk youths? Maybe the differences in the education system. So if that is the differences in the education system, where then I think the individual strengths of the child has to be somehow acknowledged, and instead of providing a same educational programs, I think there has to be more individualized. I wouldn't even say individualized, but there has to be more catered learning and development opportunities for the children of the Skps community. Again, the differences, as I said, the differences in the way the North Koreans behave and the way that South Koreans behave might have to be explained to both North Koreans and South Koreans so that there is a better understanding amongst the youth populations. There was a cases of, we did a story on a digital divide and of one of the schools in which is catering, I think Yeonman School. I forgot the name, but it's a school for North Korean Skps children, and how the COVID pandemic was not allowing the digital, because many families didn't have computers and they were not. It was not easy for them to cope with online classes because they didn't have enough parental support because they had to go to work. The school used to provide lunches, but then if you are home, that was not fully provided. So the school, we run a story on that, mentioning how the populations supported the computers and how the school was used as a space for children, because that was more like a safe space for children, and how when the school was not there, how that was not protected, and what can be done to protect that space. So that is a good example where the community has come together, provided computers, understood what were the issues there, and try to address that problem from a more holistic point of view, rather than just looking from a computer. That was not only a digital divide, but also looking into a broader aspects of care at home, but also issues regarding a safe space for children who comes together and mingles with each other. So when you are looking for the youth's empowerment or addressing children issues, I think it's important to look from a broader holistic issues and address them together than to look from a more one issues just to address one simple issue. I'll leave it there.
Well, the right to a nationality is protected under international law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 has a general is mentioning the right to nationality in general, and also human rights treaties like International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966 provides specific norms for the right to nationality. The Convention on the Rights of Child of 1989 provides that children's right to acquire a nationality is guaranteed. And China is a state party to all of this. State party to Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, state party to Convention on the Rights of Child. So China has every obligation to make sure that no children born in China becomes stateless. In reality, the Chinese government position towards North Koreans in China, North Korean defectors in China, is to consider them as illegal economic migrants rather than refugees. So this also needs to change, but whether they are illegal economic migrants or they are asylum seekers, it doesn't matter. Whoever they are, children born of them should be given a nationality.
So it's very comforting to hear from the two prominent speakers about the rights these children have to get protection that they need. I would like to get some questions from the audience, especially I know there are students who came today for a new experience. So if you would like to ask questions, you can raise your hand and the microphone is here.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Wilson from the Conflict Analysis and Resolution Program. I appreciate these great detailed the information that you provided to us. Both you gentlemen are doing a great service to the causes. I have a great appreciation for the United Nations and the work they do, and of course, for now, Save the Children and the past work you've done as well, Dr. Oh. So I have two quick questions, if I may. The first one to Dr. Oh is that we talk about human rights a lot at different levels, but do we always make the connection between, if there is a connection, in your personal opinion, the connection between human rights and human security and the argument for more or less sanctions within the North Korean context? So that's my question to you, Dr. Oh. My other question is when it comes to United Nations, as I said earlier, they have great organizations, they have enormous wealth of knowledge and organizations, sub-organizations. But sometimes I feel as a practitioner that there's kind of a split personality in the United Nations. At the national level or international level, we have a lot of work going into the articles and statements on human rights in different countries. And then you provided a great list of things that we all should be doing for help North Koreans and their human rights and human securities. But I wonder if we collectively, especially in even the United Nations, is not trying to put a Band-Aid on the problem or to give medicine that is going to maybe make the problem get a little bit better, but we're not going to the root of the problems. In other words, the basic human rights and human security of those trying to escape, to find a better life, or to survive. So if you could address that and how we can get to the roots of that, I would be greatly in your debt.
Thank you. Do we have some questions on the Zoom? Like if there's any question that came in, can we take one or two questions as well? I think you can address all the questions altogether as the last remark.
Yes, so thank you for the insightful panel discussion. We have a question from George Mason University Korea professor Lester Kurtz to Ambassador Joon Oh. And he asked, could the ambassador please say more about what NGOs can do to address human rights in North Korea? Are they also addressing difficulties of North Koreans living in the Republic of Korea?
One more question I can take.
한국어로 질문해도 가능합니까? 네. 띵크 대표 손문경입니다. 저는 포카렐 인권사무소 소장님께 여쭙고 싶습니다. 지금 이 회의장 밖에서는 유엔에서 이야기하는 SDG에 속한 탈북 아동 청소년이 한국에 들어와서 교육권의 충분한 보장을 받고 있지 못하다는 권고 사항이 2019년에 있었습니다. 그래서 저희들이 그것을 해결하기 위해서 그런 문제, SDG에서 이야기하는 탈북 청소년에 관계된 것들이 무엇인지를 찾아서 그것을 캠페인을 하고 있는데요. 지금 아까 말씀하셨듯이 유엔에서 많은 역할들을 하고 계시다고 말씀하셨습니다. 한국에 들어와 있는 이 탈북 청소년이나 혹은 중국에 있는 탈북 여성의 자녀들의 교육의 문제라든가 그런 것을 위해서 유엔이 어떤 액션을 하고 있는 것이 있는지 알고 싶습니다.
Well, I mean, we do have a limited time, but we could get one more question, and then I think we'll have the final address from them. There is somebody at the back. Could you let me know who you are first?
May I use the Korean instead of using English? 안녕하세요. 저는 조지 메이슨 코리아의 글로벌 어페어에 다니고 있는 노진홍이라고 합니다. 사실 제가 저번 세션부터 들으면서 질문을 남기고 싶었는데 이번에 Save the Children하고 그 다음에 학생들에 대한 디렉션에 대해서 이야기가 나와서 다시 한번 여쭙고 싶어서 질문을 남깁니다. 지금 대부분의 한국이나 NGO 정책들은 북한 탈북 청소년들에게 직접적인 도움을 주는 것을 선호하고 있습니다. 근데 아까 단장님께서 저번 세션에서 말씀하셨다시피 일부 학생들은 커밍아웃을 하는 걸 꺼려하는데 과연 우리가 탈북 청소년들을 도울 때 직접적으로 이 청소년은 탈북 학생이니 우리가 도와야 되지 않을까요? 라는 것을 제안하는 것보다는 저는 사실 학생들이 우리 같이 일반 고등학교를 다니고 초등학교를 다니고 그 다음에 중학교를 다니면서 정상적으로 일반 한국 학생들과 동일한 커리큘럼을 통해서 대학을 진학하고 그 학생들이 나중에 그 경험들을 바탕으로 다음 탈북 청소년들을 도울 수 있다고 생각합니다. 그래서 제가 여쭙고 싶은 거는 과연 이러한 현재 우리 한국 정부들과 그 다음에 많은 NGO들에서 실행하고 있는 다이렉트 에이드가 훨씬 탈북 청소년들에게 도움이 될 것이라고 생각하는지, 아니면 다이렉트로 도움을 주기보다는 서브스티튜셔널 정보 아니고 그리고 뒤쪽에서 백그라운드에서 그 청소년들을 보호하고 지원함으로써 한국에 적응을 하는 것을 도와주는 것이 더 나은 휴먼 라이트를 위하는 것인지, 둘 중에 어떤 게 더 옳다고 생각하시는지 두 분 모두에게 질문하고 싶습니다.
Thank you. I think I'm going to give you the microphone to sort of wrap up, give the final comments, plus addressing some of the questions that was raised to both of you. And I think that will be sort of a good end to this panel discussion. Would you like to go first, Ambassador?
Thank you. Well, I will try to address the first question by the professor there, and also the question online she read, and probably part of the last question as well. If I understood correctly, the first question from the professor there was about connection between human rights and sanctions imposed on North Korea. Is this fair understanding of your question? Yeah. Well, some countries, such as the United States, stopped providing humanitarian assistance to North Korea, both for the reasons of nuclear provocation and also human rights issue. So there are countries that impose sanctions due to human rights abuses. But in general, as I explained during my presentation, unlike peace and security issues, human rights issues are usually not, they do not lead to sanctions, because the United Nations, by its charter, does not have enforcement power when it comes to human rights. United Nations has enforcement power only on peace and security issues. So some people think this is absurd because a lot of human rights violations are causing great deal of suffering on people. And if you have a serious human rights violation, necessarily it is they threaten or they break peace as well. So, not having enforcement power on human rights violations is absurd. So to a certain extent, that kind of argument is a new trend. And we do have new measures, which I briefly touched on, like R2P, Responsibility to Protect, or ICC. So we do have a little bit of enforcement measures when it comes to human rights violations as well. And some countries are taking it, by their hand, and they are imposing unilateral sanctions on countries that are abusing human rights, like United States. So there is certain connection between human rights and sanctions, but the sanctions right now imposed on North Korea are mostly about nuclear weapons and missile provocations. They don't have to do with human rights. And the question she read, what can NGOs do to address human rights in North Korea? Well, actually, there are a lot of things that NGOs can do. One of the things is the meeting we are having here right now. Think is also an NGO devoted to the promotion of human rights in North Korea. So you can do a lot of awareness campaign and events like this. And also you can directly pressure North Korean government to do something about their human rights situation. But when it comes to human rights, as we have two international covenants, one on civil and political rights, the other on economic and social rights, usually civil and political rights are freedoms to do something. So these rights will only be fully guaranteed when they have democracy. So, North Korea is not likely to have a democracy in the near future. But of course, we cannot wait indefinitely for North Korea to have democracy. So there is other group of human rights, which is usually called economic and social rights. Economic and social rights have a lot to do with the government's capability. Right to education, right to health care. If North Korean government doesn't have capability, the people in North Korea cannot enjoy them. So we can provide assistance to North Korea. But because of the sanctions, as the professor mentioned, because of the sanctions, we cannot provide economic assistance. We can only provide humanitarian assistance. So I think what we can do to improve economic and social rights of North Koreans, we can provide humanitarian assistance as it is allowed. So NGOs can do two things. They can advocate human rights and liberty in North Korea. At the same time, they can do humanitarian assistance to people in North Korea. The last question posed in Korean was about North Korean adolescents, youth, the youth from North Korea, and assistance to them. I don't think the Korean government can provide more assistance to a certain group of North Koreans in Korea, because it will bring a kind of fairness debate, and if the government provides more assistance, that should be applied to all North Koreans in South Korea, not just the youth. So what we can expect is more assistance from non-governmental players like corporates, NGOs. They can have more scholarships for youth from North Korea. They can provide some other forms of assistance to youth from North Korea living in South Korea.
Mr. Pokharel, can I give you 2 minutes for you to address the questions?
On the questions of whether the UN is just band-aiding or looking into a more holistic approach to addressing the human rights issues, just to add on what the ambassador said, is the UN basically is looking into 3 fronts. One is continuing to document and monitor the situations so that if things changes in terms of politically in the Dprk, then there could be some accountability in future with these informations. The second is providing a minimum humanitarian assistance to the people who are suffering from hunger or from food or education or health. A very basic minimum, again, that's not. And the third is not trying its best to ensure that the Dprk doesn't completely isolate itself. So trying to engage even just to talk, with no expectation. So I think that's the 3 things that the UN and the international community are doing, is not allowing the Dprk to slip in without not engaging at all, with complete no expectations. So of course it's not a holistic approach that we see that things will change in the future, but that's what we are doing now, whether it's good or bad, and I think it's the future which will tell what. Again, is it enough? I don't know. Maybe not, but there might be more to be done and look at. But again, it will depend on the member states also and the bigger politics, and having bigger players in the regions does complicate things, which is not that easy. On the issues regarding the youths, I think aids are always useful, but looking into the root causes why the youths are not assimilating properly needs to be, at least someone has to do a proper research and look from a more holistic point of view, because it can be partially addressing the economic circumstances of the individuals, but it might not be addressing the other aspects like family issues or others, so or even social issues. I think the ideal environment would be where the youths can accept their North Korean origin and be proud of that, and I think that would be the ideal situations. On the issues regarding whether the UN agencies are providing direct support to the North Koreans in China or in South Korea, I don't think so. Because there might not be programs directly, at least in China. I don't think so. I'm not fully aware of all the agencies' programs, but I would doubt if there is any in China, at least. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think we had a very promising note from the UN that leaving no one behind. And I'm sure that means that human security in the gray zone will not be forgotten by the United Nations. With this note, I'm going to close our panel discussion. Thank you so much for watching.